So again, welcome everyone to Batten Hour today. We are excited today to feature our own professors, Craig Volden and Gerry Warburg, as they share with us the release of the newest legislative effectiveness scores, which are released biannually by the Center for Effective Lawmaking. Most of you on this call surely know Professor Volden and Professor Warburg, but what I think will be especially fun today is that they both bring unique perspectives as an academic and a practitioner turned professor. So it's going to be an interesting balance of sort of bringing the various expertise of our two beloved professors. So I'm going to turn it over to Professors Volden and Warburg, and then at the conclusion of their presentation, they have asked you use the raise your hand feature for Q&A, and they will be calling on you with your questions. So without further ado, let's find out who our most effective lawmakers are. Thanks, Professor Volden and Professor Warburg.
Outstanding. Thanks, Jill. Delighted to have Gerry join me today to give his perspectives. I'm going to kind of tell you briefly about the center and our new scores, and then Gerry will tell us what they actually mean. So that'll be a fun conversation. So the Center for Effective Lawmaking, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a partnership between the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University. The vision of the center is a Congress comprised of effective lawmakers, strong institutional capacity, and the incentive structure needed to address America's greatest public policy challenges. Of course, we're not there yet. So the mission of the center is to help move us in that direction through the advancement of the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and US legislative institutions. The way that we do a lot of our work, though certainly not all, is to base our work on kind of quantitative analysis, good social science, developing hypotheses and testing them. And one of our key measures is what we're talking about today, our legislative effectiveness scores. These scores are for each member of Congress, each member of the House, and each member of the Senate, and they're based on a combination of 15 metrics in terms of the bills that members sponsor and how far they move through the lawmaking process. So for example, in the 116th Congress, the one that just ended, for each legislator, we count up the number of bills that they sponsor. We look at how many of those bills received action in committee. This could be a hearing or a markup or a subcommittee vote. How many of them received action beyond committee, made it to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate? How many of them passed their home chamber, and how many of them became law? So 5 stages of the lawmaking process. But we also know and have to account for the fact that not every bill is the same. And so in our scores, we upgrade the substantive and significant bills, the biggest ones of the day, the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package or major immigration reform and so on. And we downgrade the commemoratives, which typically are namings of post offices and so on. So 3 different levels of bill significance, 5 stages of the process, and we combine those into a single legislative effectiveness score. We average those to a value of 1 in the House and a value of 1 in the Senate. And we've done this for some time. So if you go to our website, thelawmakers.org, you can look up any member's score, both the House and the Senate, for any Congress from the recently completed 116th Congress all the way back to the 93rd Congress in the early 1970s. You can sort them by a variety of categories. You can look just at your state that's of particular interest to you. And you can now look at 21 different issue areas. So if you're wondering who's really effective in health or education and so on, you'd be able to pull that up on the website as well. What we want to talk with you about today is those new findings that we just released this month from the 116th Congress, the one that ended in January. And so I'm going to show Professor Warburg the top 10 lists of Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate, see what his thoughts are there. Also want to look at streaks of those who are exceeding expectations. So for every member of Congress, we set up a benchmark because we expect freshman from the minority party not to perform as well as a 10th term majority party committee chair. And so then we look at how they relate to those benchmarks. Do they exceed those expectations significantly, at least 50% or more above their benchmarks? And we see that some members of Congress are not just good in one Congress, but have been keeping up effective lawmaking in Congress after Congress. I'll also highlight some of the top freshmen and see what Gerry has to say about them before we start talking about some broad patterns, maybe some implications for the current 117th Congress, and then opening it broadly to your questions and our attempted answers. So Gerry, the big reveal, here are the top 10 Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives, according to our metric. Democrats, we have Lowy, DeFazio, Maloney, down to a top 10, a freshman member, Elaine Luria from Virginia. And Republicans, we have McCall, Smith, Katko, all the way down to Stefanik on our top 10 lists. Anybody catch your eye there?
Yeah, there are a bunch of fascinating things about these lists, and I want to be candid with the group that Professor Volden has, in a sustained campaign over 10 years, made me a true believer in this data. As a practitioner, used to try to count votes on the House and Senate floor as a young staffer. I had my own tells on where a member was going to go and how to predict their outcomes, but I think that Professor Volden, Professor Wiseman, and CEL's done really an extraordinary job of controlling for a whole bunch of variables. That people like me and Professor Savage, I see on the call, Dean Solomon and others have seen firsthand dealing with members, but I think CEL really does a great job. So a few things right away, Craig. First of all, chairmanships are diminished in power. You see, particularly in the Senate, a bunch of people who are not necessarily committee chairs playing significant roles, people like Gary Peters and Cory Gardner. But yeah, being chair of appropriations still matters. So Nita Lowey's number one. She's retiring, she's veteran, but also DeFazio, who has a somewhat prickly personality. Some people don't get along with him quite so well. He's from the People's Republic of Portland, very progressive area, but he chairs transportation and infrastructure, and they control a lot of money and will again this year. So chairmanships still do matter there. But look at some of the other names. And let me name names and be specific. There's some members in Congress who have a reputation for being so-called show horses. Don't get between John Kerry and the camera, you'll get trampled, was the old joke about Senator Kerry. Well, he turned out to be a workhorse in the end. There are a couple of names that jump out here. Eleanor Holmes Norton doesn't even have a floor vote. She represents DC. Sheila Lee Jackson, very outspoken, often on cable TV a lot, but here they are legislating a lot. And I think that ought to humble us about caricature about some of the members. And I'd say that for Chris Smith and Andy Barr as well on the Republican side. Second thing is, there's still a practice of leadership trying to help members in tough races. So you see Stefanik, you see Luria as freshmen popping up on a top 10 most effective, surely helpful to their reelect that they were getting stuff done. And I would suspect there were cases where they featured Congresswoman Luria in debate, gave her the amendment to offer as a way of highlighting their role. Finally, I was struck by the fact, and we'll get to this more in some of the future slides, Craig, that being in the minority doesn't mean you can't do anything. Particularly the Republican moderates in the minority in the Pelosi House and the Democratic moderates in the McConnell Senate in 2019-20, I think did quite well.
I'm going to pop those senators up here now as well. I think you mentioned Gary Peters at the top of our list.
So it's just the few dozen of us here in the Batten family. I'm going to name names again. Marco Rubio has a reputation for getting on TV a lot, maybe not legislating so much. Gary Peters was considered one of the least effective Democratic senators by inside the Beltway wisdom, who was imperiled in his Michigan reelect and famously was behind for 3 or 4 days between November 3rd and November 7th during the slow count. Merkley, nondescript guy you could walk by in the subway and not know he was a senator. Mosto, a freshman. Moran, John Kennedy, we see a lot on TV. Cory Gardner. These are people who did a lot of legislating as well. Democrats, they tend to be moderates. Tester, Duckworth, some of the more moderate Democratic members, Klobuchar, Casey, pro-life Democrat, Shaheen. But these are people who are able to work across the aisle in a divided Congress and get stuff done. And I think it ought to cause us to reassess the skill sets that some of these members bring to the table.
One thing that I noticed here, I'm not listing all of the scores out just to make the names big enough that people might be able to read them, but we had the very rare instance where the top performer overall in the Senate, Gary Peters, was not in the majority party. What do you make of that? How does that sort of thing happen?
And folks, this is something I really want to underscore, particularly for the students of Volden and Warburg here. I was looking for confirmation bias. This is the opposite. This runs completely against my assumptions from inside the Beltway chatter. That, you know, Gary Peters, too quiet, doesn't look like a senator, going to have a tough reelect, not on TV enough. But here he was legislating repeatedly, tracked a number of ways through the CEL data. And the skeptic in me, Professor Volden, says that's because leadership pushed them forward and the committee chairs pushed them forward and they gave them floor time. And if they had an amendment they cooked up in caucus, they said, well, let's let Peters offer it. That may be unfair to Senator Peters. It could be that once a label gets attached to somebody in Washington, like the false label that John Kerry was just interested in getting on TV, not in doing legislation, it may take some time for reality and facts to catch up with that. And I think that's one of the great services that CEL provides, because we're totally apartisan, nonpartisan. We're not about, you know, making friends look good and making enemies look bad, et cetera. We're letting the data dictate our analysis. And I think that leadership probably worked pretty carefully with some of these members, testers also in a red state as a blue Democrat, to make sure these folks were featured. And in other cases like Marco Rubio, it just shows that they were doing the hard work. Now, Marco has a new chief of staff the last 4 years, Mike Needham, who came from Heritage Action, a friend of Batten. And it may be that he also had very good staff work here to support him.
The other thing on Peters was certainly coming into a big election year there as a senator, and doesn't happen except every third cycle. And the fact that, you know, Republicans let his bills move forward was something that was a surprise to me. We have the good fortune of having an interview scheduled with him in April. So people who want to check that out on the CEL website later on after we conduct that, will learn a lot more there. Want to move on to our longest streaks here. So I mentioned we have the benchmarks, and we have those people who exceed expectations on those benchmarks. And here are coming through the 116th, but going back in time, those who are on a winning streak in consistently performing above, you know, up here at the top of the list, Don Young, every Congress since he arrived in 1973, whether he's in the minority or majority, a committee chair or not, he's been exceeding expectations. And likewise, Eleanor Norton here, Holmes Norton, every Congress she's been in has been in exceeding expectations category.
It's remarkable again. And I really want to hammer the point. Don't look for confirmation bias. Look for information and follow it. Follow where the data leads and challenge old assumptions. Don Young doesn't surprise me at all. He's a wonderful character. His entire office is filled with statuary from his days as a big game hunter in Alaska. That's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's very much Don Young's personality. But he'll work with anybody on anything. And I referenced the front page of today's Washington Post. Congress revives earmarks. Don Young is a horse trader. He'll say, hey, if I put this provision in here to expand the national park in Astoria, Oregon, will you, Peter DeFazio, vote for my bill? And that's how he would make sure everybody had a stake in his bills. They tend to go through public lands and interior, which has a lot of legislation. But he doesn't bring ideology as his first point. He's a Freedom Caucus conservative Republican, but he's interested in getting stuff done. And there are a couple other names I'd call listeners' attention to. Number one is number 10. Hakeem Jeffries is someone that a lot of inside the Beltway types were not initially familiar with the congressman. I think there's a very strong chance he's going to be the next Speaker of the House, and the first person of color in congressional leadership since Bill Gray of Pennsylvania served a generation ago. And he certainly had a featured role in the second impeachment, in other things. And the fact that he's also been doing not just the party work of building support for himself within the party, but the work of legislating as well.
Yeah, again, so Jeffries has been there 4 Congresses and in our exceeding expectations each and every one of those.
And again, folks, I'm being honest here, I wouldn't have expected that, but the data doesn't lie here. And I think that's a really important way of challenging assumptions. 2 other names I want to pull out real quick. One is Rob Portman. As many of you know, I worked with the other party, but I have enormous respect for Senator Portman, and he's going to be an enormous loss to the United States Congress, in my opinion. His willingness to defend the institution on things like tariffs and trade, his willingness to work across the aisle, his non-ideological approach to getting stuff done for the American people. But it doesn't surprise me he's on there. But I'm sure that some of the stuff that put him on this list was stuff McConnell did not want him doing. So it's certain profile and courage. Ditto with Chris Smith, who famously lost his gavel at vets for crossing Newt Gingrich on funding for vets. And Senator Smith, who's quite conservative, actually grew more moderate after crossing swords with his leadership. The other name, and I have to do this affectionately, full disclosure, he's my best friend in the United States Congress, but Congressman Connolly's on this list. And Gerry Connolly has been somewhat skeptical of data collection, and he thinks it's all like poker or old school baseball, and he's skeptical of the new analytics creeping into modern baseball as well. But here he is, and I will have to tease Congressman Connolly about this because Gerry Connolly does do the hard work of coalition building and offering amendments with co-sponsors. And he insists the data doesn't show this, that the chairman gets too much credit or the chairwoman. Not true, there are controls for that. So I'll have to use this data with the congressman affectionately because he's also a great friend of the school and very generous with his time. So I don't want to twit him too hard. But yeah, the data doesn't lie. A couple other people who got picked for the impeachment team, the congressman from Rhode Island, his name I always mispronounce, Cicciolini. He's on there.
Even my spell checker was highlighting that one, yeah.
Yep, good deal. What do you see in that list, Craig? Is there something particularly surprising to you?
Well, the thing that we might have some skepticism about is, within any one Congress, somebody can have a bunch of hits or, be pushed forward as they're in a tough election battle or whatever. And so, what I'm drawn to are these folks who just year in, year out, Congress after Congress are exceeding expectations. We had the pleasure of talking to Representative Young last year. We're hoping we'll get to interview Delegate Holmes Norton here in the future, and really want to hear, what do you do? How do you keep it going so effectively over time? For Young, that was certainly a focus on his home state and his constituency and bringing constituents issues forward. But for others, it's a variety of things. And so hearing those lessons. Up next, a number of the freshmen. Here I'm listing, and we had kind of a bumper crop of freshmen who were in our exceeds expectation category this time around. Now, it's certainly the case that being in the majority party is helping. At the top of our list is Democrats. Further down the list, though, I'm picking up some of the top Republicans here and drawn to noting a lot of Virginians on this list of effective freshmen, Gerry.
I will recall an incident for you guys from my dark days as a lobbyist. We would look for public works initiatives in a freshman's district and then go pitch them that we could help them get across the finish line. This was very Machiavellian, a little bit Francis Underwood, but the fact was we knew that leadership would go out of their way to try to help, let's bring it home, an Abigail Spanberger, a new fresh woman in a purple district who everybody knew from day one was going to have a tough re-election fight. I think those facts obtained, certainly for Luria. They didn't appear to obtain for Wexton because that was old Frank Wolf's district and Barbara Comstock. The assumption is it's now a blue district per generation. But freshmen and freshwomen, when they go to leadership saying, I'd like to have a major role in the fight for a balanced budget or in the fight for, the Dreamers legislation, smart leaders elevate first-year members and give them a visible role. Look what Mitch McConnell did with Senator Martha McSally, trying to give her a featured role on some of the sexual assault issues involving the military. Ben Klein, Michael Guest, Crenshaw, again, got support from their leadership to have a featured role. The old days of Sam Rayburn and LBJ telling members to sit down and shut up for the first 10 years in Congress and just, if they want to get along, go along, those are over. Leadership now looks to their imperiled freshman members. I think you'll see this with Mark Kelly in Arizona. You already see it with the other Arizona senator. You see it with Joe Manchin often, getting a lot of slack from leadership to vote with the other party sometimes, but also to be featured when there is a compromise.
Let me ask you a little bit about McSally there. So, you know, she was filling out John McCain's term, was up for a special election against Mark Kelly. She had a bunch of things, you know, how she got a 1.5 here was she had a bunch of things that she put forward that passed the Senate. And then the record as I'm seeing them is held at desk in the House. So when they went over, they weren't sent to committee. What do you make of that sort of thing? You know, was that political?
Yes, that was political. That was Pelosi helping Schumer try to become majority leader. And I bet you some of those Luria bills that came over to the McConnell Senate were dead on arrival. Unfortunate, not something that used to be done as much back in the day. I remember a bill I worked on for 3 months called the Support East European Democracy Act, very quaint. This is when the Warsaw Pact was falling apart, but the Berlin Wall had not yet fallen. I worked on it for months, and my boss gave the entire bill to a senator named Paul Simon from Illinois, who was a freshman up for re-election with a strong group of ethnic Americans from Eastern Europe in his district. And Paul Simon ran with my bill and got re-elected. I like to think it had something to do with it. But yeah, leadership does help members, and opposite party leadership does try to thwart efforts to feature the good work of an imperiled member. I dare say Spanberger's bills probably didn't do real well in the McConnell Senate. Yeah,
yeah. We're going to open this up for Q&A in a little bit, but I do want to ask you a couple broad trends beyond those lists, Gerry, in particular. If we think about some of the trends, I think we already mentioned this idea that near the top of our list were a variety of committee chairs and subcommittee chairs. But one thing I noticed was just how kind of poorly they performed as committee chairs in this Congress, the 116th compared to in the past. And actually, that's part of a larger trend. So for example, it used to be, you know, when we look at our data back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, we have this normalization to an average of 1, but committee chairs were getting 3s and 4s and 5s consistently, you know, the average. And here the average committee chair is getting like a 1.4 in the Senate. So only slightly above the normal member. And committee chairs in the House on average in this 116th Congress had a little over 1 of their bills become law, whereas in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was 3 or 4 or 5 of their bills becoming law. A lot of that, I think, might be traced back to the reforms of the 90s, party seizing control away from committee chairs. But what do you draw for that?
I think it's part of the tragedy of the modern Congress, losing its ability to do big, ambitious things. We all know this. The lay persons on this phone call who don't pay a lot of attention to Congress know this. They wait till the last minute, and the bills get written in the leadership conference room. They're not written in committee. They don't go through subcommittee and full committee markups with full hearings. And when they do, the minority party still votes against the bill after all their amendments have been accepted. So more and more and more, we're seeing the bills written in the anteroom of Mr. McConnell, Mr. Schumer, Ms. Pelosi, and Mr. McCarthy. Let's be fair and let's be honest. The people who are writing the bills in the anteroom are the committee chairs and the ranking member. But often the bill will end up with the name of, you know, Mr. Jeffries as the whip, or Senator McSally as the senator who's up for re-election and needs the face time, Congresswoman Luria. So the committee chairs driving the bus, controlling the flow and managing the bill on the floor has really gone by the wayside. And I think that is a loss for the nation and a loss for the institution. But again, for people who are skeptical about data and think it's all just a poker game and you got to read people's tells, the data doesn't lie. Professor Volden's numbers showing that 5 and 6 and 7 scores have gone down to 1.8s for committee chairs. That's real data, and it reflects a reality that we need to be sober and realistic in addressing. And any lobbyist or any NGO would have to take that into account in setting their strategy.
The other broad pattern that I was seeing there, Gerry, we had mentioned Gary Peters being the top performer despite being in the minority party. That felt like it was part of something bigger. So for example, in the Senate, Democrats in the 115th Congress, the one before the one we're talking about, were introducing about 40 bills each. In the 116th, they were introducing about 60 bills each. And then, surprising to me, they were getting those bills through the Republican Senate. Actually, you know, our data go back to the early 1970s, and we were finding that the minority party in the Senate had passed more laws in the 116th Congress than in any Congress dating back to the early 1970s. It surprised us for a variety of reasons. One is that, you know, there are fewer laws being produced now than there were back in the 70s. Bills, you know, have become bigger and more omnibus. But, you know, in addition to that, you know, this idea that we're in such a hyper-partisan mode, how does the minority party get anything done at all? And here they are producing more laws than we've seen, you know, previously in the past 50 years. I'll tweak you a little bit on this one. That tells me that Democrats, when they were in the minority, could pass things. Now they're in the majority and they say we can't pass things without filibuster reform. So what's going on there?
It's fascinating to me that it shows up that way. My experience, there's no place lonelier than being a frosh in the minority. Just ask Mark Warner how much he liked his first term in the Senate after being governor and chief executive.
Yeah.
He's quite articulate about it. We were joking in our large undergraduate class last week that there was a political cartoon saying the 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and Joe Manchin. A handful of senators are extremely powerful right now. You know their names, Collins, Murkowski, Manchin, etc. There are worse things. To have than empowered. In my day, there were 20 Democrats we had to count really carefully because they weren't gimme votes. And there were 20 Republican votes we could get when I worked for the majority whip in the Senate from 1979 to 1990. And that's changed dramatically. But I think it does show the power of a John McCain turning his thumb down in the well that saved EPA, or of Joe Manchin saying, no, it's a bridge too far to reward the new OMB nominee. I may disagree with some of the decisions these legislators have made, but I don't underestimate the courage that it takes to buck the party leadership. And I think it's actually an encouraging sign. And it does beg the question, you know, why can't the Democrats pick up 2 or 3 Republican votes to get stuff done without going nuclear and eliminating the filibuster?
Yeah. We've had a patient set of guests here, so feel free for any of you on the Zoom call to raise your hands and start asking questions. But before we turn to those, Gerry, anything that this tells you about the current 117th Congress and what we might expect moving forward?
It's going to be tight. It's going to be tough. And I think most of us who observe closely know we're coming up to a critical point. It's a question on some of our midterm exams for the Congress class, but everybody in the country now knows about reconciliation. It's a poorly kept secret, but you can't do voting rights by reconciliation. You can't do infrastructure bills by reconciliation. And according to the Senate parliamentarian, you can't do the $15 an hour minimum wage by reconciliation. And at some point in the next 90 to 180 days, Schumer and Biden are going to have to decide whether they're going to work with the Republicans to try to come to some common ground on these issues, or whether they're going to try to change the modern Senate dramatically and eliminate the filibuster. Initially, perhaps for just one set of bills having to do with voting rights, you could make the moral high ground argument, invoke John Lewis's memory, etc. And I could make that argument and write that floor statement myself. But whether you want to basically render the 50 Republican senators in the United States Senate irrelevant, I exaggerate for effect, by saying we're going to have 50 Democrats on the vice president, jam through our entire agenda, and Katie barred the door, Puerto Rico's a state, Washington, D.C.'s a state, and they got 2 senators, Wyoming, we got our revenge. I mean, you can imagine that the agenda going right up to and including some of Senator Bernie Sanders' agenda items that he can muscle through. And that's where the Arizona senator, the West Virginia senator, some of the New Hampshire senators might not support Schumer. But that's going to happen, people. It's going to happen in the next 90 to 180 days. And it will probably be the most fateful decision that Biden and Schumer make in terms of executive legislative relations in the entire 4 years of President Biden's term.
Great.
What do you think is going to happen with the filibuster, Professor Volden?
I'm sorry?
What do you think is going to happen with the filibuster? Do you have any prognosis?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, as you're saying, the coming weeks are going to be really intriguing. I think the best case forward for filibuster reform is try to get 60 votes for a while and show that you're making a strong case on things that Manchin, Sinema, and others would be interested in passing. And if you can't get it done with 60 votes, that makes it easier for them to bring about filibuster reform. And so always having that in their back pocket is really an intriguing option. Jim Savage, I see we have a question.
Yes, Gerry, you and I both worked in federal relations. You in one perspective, I think, for Cassidy, and I was working for the University of California. Earmarking was a big deal. And now it seems to be on the rise. You mentioned in your presentation. What do you think this is going to do to the rank ordering of these members that you've been talking about for the last half hour?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for your service to my family's alma mater, University of California, Jim. I think it's not going to have a very profound effect. I think that it will begin to empower committee chairs because the bills are written in committee and everybody in the committee has a stake in it. The committee used to defend the bill as a team on the House and Senate floor. Republicans and Democrats would defend the bill against non-committee members. And God forbid other committees that were poaching on our jurisdiction. It was usually John Dingell, because he was very aggressive about jurisdiction. But I think what you'll see is most of the members of the Appropriations Committee will vote for the Appropriations Committee bill because they've got stuff in it. And chairs have a way of taking members' stuff out of the bill if they don't vote for it. They offer a manager's amendment on the House or Senate floor as the First Amendment, and they strike out those people's goodies. The problem with that analysis that we have to be honest about, Jim, is that, and I don't wish this to sound partisan, I believe it's factually accurate, the experience the Democrats had on Obamacare really burned them, and it shaped Schumer's thinking the last 4 years. Because what happened on Obamacare is they waited a year and they went through months of markups in different committees, and they accepted dozens, scores, I believe the number went into triple figures, hundreds of Republicans' amendments to improve the Romney Care, market-based approach, moderate Affordable Care Act approach, but then every single Republican voted against the bill. I was much more hopeful about this Congress until I saw every single Republican in the Congress vote against the $1.9 trillion stimulus because it was too big, too much spending, too much pork. And then a week later, the Republican National Committee ran national ads saying the Democrats failed to provide enough money for coronavirus relief, which I thought was a striking contradiction in arguments. So the fact that the Republicans are lined up en bloc against the bill early in the Congress will make it harder for them to vote for appropriations measures and infrastructure measures, even though they have projects in the bill, even though they have home state money coming directly back to their communities. In some cases, they were elected saying, hey, I'll get that, Route 28 bypass over 66. I'll get that done if you elect me. Then there's money in the bill and they vote against their own provision. It's going to be tricky, but I don't think it's going to change the rankings much other than to make the committee chair's power, the committee chair's scores go up a little bit.
Right. So anything that's going to help more bills move through the process could raise all boats. But you're saying particularly the votes of those that are incorporating earmarks in their calculations. And so more party leadership folks, presumably, and more chairs.
And you'll see more ranking members buck their party leadership to support the bill, Professor Savage. You won't have the ranking member of appropriations work to get 150 Republican projects in the bill and then vote against it on the floor. I don't think that will happen. I think if that happens, you'll see a motion to strike all their projects as the next motion.
Question from Nora Serby.
Hi, thank you. This discussion has been really interesting. I was just wondering whether you see a gender difference in the legislative effectiveness scores, or if you don't even take that into consideration.
So yeah, we see a few things there. So we don't bake in anything, right? So we don't bake in, you're a committee chair, therefore we'll give you a higher score. We just see that emerging. Members of the majority party are more effective as well. And one thing that we found for a long time is that women are more effective than men, particularly when in the minority party. And so if we think kind of behaviorally, you're in the minority party, it's a sad place to be, as Gerry is pointing out. What do you do there? And from what we've seen, on average, not all, but on average, minority party men tend to be a little more obstructionist, and minority party women, relative to that, tend to keep working on their bills, caring deeply about their issues and reaching across party lines. How that plays out, I guess we saw that a bit in our top 10 list for Democrats in the Senate, a number of women on that list. And so just kind of thinking about, is that pattern holding up? Seems to be somewhat, but anything that we're talking about minority party versus majority party differences has to also take into consideration that women in Congress are small in number, especially in the Republican Party. And so seeing those differences play out across parties has been fascinating as well. Not always linked to what we would think as sort of classic, why would you get a bill through, being more moderate, the vote share, and are you really focused on re-election, a variety of those considerations, just this broad pattern that we've seen in minority party women keeping their bills alive and moving them forward. Thanks for the question.
I could just add one thing as a comfort to those of us who want to see change happen more swiftly. Nora, when I worked in the Senate in the 80s, the Women's Senate Caucus was very, very small. There wasn't even a restroom for women senators to use off the Senate floor. They famously had to walk quite a ways. There was just no accommodation there because it was an old boys club. When Feinstein and Boxer got elected in 1992 in the same election when my boss retired, they made the cover of Time magazine, the Year of the Women. I think there were like 6 out of 100. And I just have to point to the arc of history that time begins to heal some of our wounds as a nation, and our legacy that we need to be very aware of on these grounds of excluding women, excluding people of color. Congress is making a heck of a lot of progress. If you look at the arc of the membership from 1992 to present day, and Professor Volden has some great slides on this, steady, solid increase. And when the Democrats get too self-congratulatory about this, look how well Republican women did in the Biden win of 2020. It's very substantial gains by women in the Republican Party. Memo to Republican leadership, stop having pictures of 36 men sitting around the White House talking about women's health care. That was a devastating photograph in 2017. And the Freedom Caucus met with President Trump, and there were 36 white men sitting around talking about women's health care. So the arc of history does bend towards greater inclusiveness, but it's slow. The other thing I say real quick is that women work better at compromise. They don't get their macho defense, can't give in stuff up as easily. I know it's a gender generalization, but my boss insisted on always having a Republican co-sponsor when we introduce a bill. And I know of several women in Congress who take the same attitude. They will not drop a bill in without a member of the opposite party. And it's often a woman they've worked with in a bipartisan women's caucus and got to know well.
So let me follow up on that bipartisan question, and others should feel free to join in with their questions as well. One thing we saw for Gary Peters, but we've seen this for others as well. I was just looking at Kirsten Sinema, how much is she working across party lines, that there are a number of members who won't put forward a bill without a co-sponsor of the other party. What do you think of that as a strategy, especially if we're saying, it's tough to overcome, partisan differences today? If you limit yourself to only bills that have a bipartisan co-sponsor, it's going to be fewer bills, but maybe ones that have a greater chance of moving forward.
Yeah, it's different between a show horse and a workhorse. It's different between a message bill and legislation. And folks, most bills just get swallowed up in an omnibus in the chairwoman's mark. Or in the appropriations conference report, suddenly it pops up. CEL is good at tracking that language. They know where it came from. But I do think you see that phenomenon occur a lot.
I was hearing that as we're following up on January 6th, that a number of Democrats aren't willing to have as co-sponsors those who voted against certification of the election. So the 147 Republicans there are perhaps on the outs for this process. And we're seeing a lot of cases where Democrats and Republicans aren't even willing to appear in the same room together under those circumstances. Tell me how you're thinking that's going to play out, and is it going to take years and years to heal those divides?
I don't think it will take years and years, but it happened to us at Batten. We had invited 2 legislators, and one said he wouldn't sit on the panel with the other one because of that vote. I think time will heal those wounds. I think there's some members who can justify those votes, though I personally disagree with them very strongly, as saying, well, we just wanted to give them a hearing. We just wanted to have further debate and wanted more information to reassure everybody that the election was legitimate. But in the face of 50 state certifications from the majority of them Republican secretaries of state, I don't buy that argument, but I understand how that can be logically advanced, wanting to show solidarity on a procedural motion. But yeah, those wounds run deep. You even saw last week, this weekend, a United States senator lecturing another United States senator saying, don't retell the story of January 6th. You and I were both in danger. Our lives were in danger. And your false narrative, everybody knows I'm talking about Senator Johnson of Wisconsin. There's no reason to hide it. But another senator was attacking him, saying, don't try to rewrite history. Senator Johnson, your life was in danger just as well as mine, just as well as our Vice President, Mike Pence's. So I think there'll be a struggle over retelling the history of January 6th. I don't think it will last too long. I think, frankly, it's one of the values of having a blue ribbon commission that kind of locks down. After all, our history of the Kennedy assassination comes from the Warren Commission. Our history of 9/11 comes from the 9/11 Commission. So I think it might be helpful to have a common narrative there. But Craig, short answer is, over time, people will work with those legislators. There have been some delegation lunches that have been canceled because the delegation doesn't even want to meet together. They'll come back to doing the people's business. They need to work together, and I think they'll do so.
We have a question from Kelly Wolf.
Hi, I was wondering, and I'm not sure if you already mentioned this, but what type of responses have you all been getting from any of the representatives or senators? Have there been any backlash, or just have there been some more positive responses from them?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So partly it's a question of how do we see politics playing out, and partly it's a question of, what is the response? So at the center, we tend to be very positive. So we've shared these top lists out there quite broadly, and a lot of members have picked them up and had press releases or tweeted about them and so on. And then the nature of politics takes off. And those near the bottoms of our list, none of which we put up here today, their opponents start to talk about how they're ineffective at lawmaking. And those come up particularly during campaigns for elections. how we think about that, though, and if somebody's not on our top list, what do they do and what could they do to kind of defend their record is really an interesting element. And there we just emphasize that we're the Center for Effective Lawmaking, but we're focused on, of course, lawmaking, and that members of Congress who are focused on other things, we think lawmaking is really central, but could be focused on oversight, could be focused on constituency services, could be focused on trying to stop horrible ideas from others. We're more about the moving forward of ideas. That those tend to be their responses, particularly those who have to take a different approach.
Could I press you on just for a second? John Boehner famously said, "Judge us by the laws we don't pass." And Mitch McConnell famously said on January 20th, 2009, "Our job is to make sure that Obama's a one-term president." We block most everything he tries to do. For years, we've respected and lauded, in some cases, legislators who stopped bad things from happening, who fought for limited government. If you're a Reagan conservative, who fought to get the federal government out of your private lives, if you're a libertarian who cares about marijuana decriminalization or even rights of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. How do you at CEL quantify the value of Jesse Helms, who objected to everything that ever happened on the Senate floor, the designated objector role that people play? Is there a special category we could create for them numerically? Bills filibustered to death. But how do you more broadly address that argument when you're challenged in the academy on it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say kind of twofold. The first thing we just looked into is we would expect, if Democrats are more interested in putting bills forward and Republicans more interested in stopping them, that we should see big differences between Democrats and Republicans. And the only difference we found there is when Democrats are in the majority party, they're moving more bills than Republicans. But when Republicans are in the majority party, they're moving more bills than Democrats. And that's exactly what we would expect if it's, not a, we're opposed to all legislation, but we have a different view of government, and we're going to advance that view of government through different policies. It might be tax cuts instead of spending increases. It might be an attempt to, overturn the Affordable Care Act as opposed to extend the Affordable Care Act. But they're still seeing the opportunity to do that through legislation as opposed to through just stopping anything and everything. We've even seen this in sort of the more extreme on the edges of the ideological spectrum, the number of bills that are put forward by Tea Party caucus members, the number that are seen put forward by very conservative Republicans or very liberal Democrats, they're really all engaged about equally in lawmaking or attempts at lawmaking, and so we see not big swaths that are saying just ideologically we're opposed to lawmaking. The second thing I'd say there is we have a couple projects underway where we're looking at those who are interested more in stopping legislation than moving it forward. One is we've gone through a number of the written records of some of the party leaders in the Senate, and we now have a pretty long list of senators and how many times they had holds on legislation that they put forward, and we want to see how related it is. If you're interested in holding or stopping legislation versus moving legislation forward, are those kind of two sides of the same coin, just very interested in legislation? And so the people with a lot of holds are also going to be the people who are at the top of our list, or are those the opposite? And likewise, we can look at committee chairs and subcommittee chairs that are able to stop bills moving through their committees or subcommittees, kind of an obstructionist role there. Who are the ones who do that, who only let things out of their committees and subcommittees of the same party or of an ideologically aligned group? And are they the most effective lawmakers or least effective lawmakers because they're more interested in stopping legislation? both of those are work in progress. People who want to always see our work in progress, go to the lawmakers.org and look at our working paper series. I see you've just had something up there, Gerry. And so it's good to have these contributions kind of across the board from all of our faculty affiliates.
Interesting, when you read through that list, Craig, I'm reminded as an old Senate person, guys, we didn't used to pick the majority leader and the minority leader based on, who can give the pithy soundbite, who can be Newt Gingrich or Nancy Pelosi on national TV. Think about some of the people that these very telegenic Sunday morning talk show press hounds picked as their leaders. Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, probably the two least effective on Sunday morning talk shows leaders we ever had, and you very rarely ever saw them on those shows. They're not the Lindsey Grahams who have the pithy quote on almost any topic. They're not the usual suspects that get put on national TV. Chris Van Hollen's also very glib and quick with the one-liner. But they picked the parliamentarians. I knew Mitch McConnell when he was a freshman. He was the designated objector for the Republicans. He'd sit on the floor all day long in case the Democrats tried to pull a fast one. He'd say, I object. And that was his job. And he'd sit there all day learning parliamentary procedure, not working in committee, not legislating a lot. So the leadership was actually picked defensively in the Senate, really for the last generation. And one of the challenges for CEL when there's less legislation is figuring out who gets credit. And my last point in that regard will sound partisan, it's not intended to. But the fact is that President Biden's predecessor really did not have a robust legislative agenda of major things he wanted the national legislature to accomplish and pass into public law. Trump famously pushed tax cuts and conservative judges. Well, conservative judges aren't public laws. They're the right that the president's party gets to pick judges that line up with your ideology. But Trump didn't have 10 things he wanted to legislate on. George W. Bush did, starting with No Child Left Behind and tax cuts. Obama did, starting with Dodd-Frank and stimulus and green energy and Affordable Care Act. And now Joe Biden has a whole bunch of things. But Biden hasn't passed a lot of bills either. He put it all in one bill. He put it in an omnibus. So you had a $1.9 trillion coronavirus response bill that dealt with historical racism to Black farmers. It dealt with child daycare tax credits and everything in between. And the Republicans are correct in criticizing it. It wasn't just a coronavirus relief package. It was a Democratic wish list. They put everything in there except the $15 minimum wage, which they even had in the House. And it'll be interesting to see whether Biden continues to do that. 2 or 3 big bills that we fight over all year long, or a broad swath of legislation. And I suspect it'll be the former.
If anybody wants the last question, I think our queue is open there. But if we don't have any, I want to send out a few thank yous. First, of course, to Professor Warburg. Always a pleasure to pick your brain on the meaning behind a lot of the findings and the numbers that we put up. And then to the CEL research assistance team. Kelly, you asked a question, but there are a bunch of others who are unable to make it today, but we're very thankful for all the work they're doing behind the scenes to help bring these numbers forward.
If I could echo those thank yous, Craig, I want to single out 2 groups of people. One is Center for Effective Lawmaking. Folks, check it out, get involved. Some students have come in there just looking for some after hours cash or whatever, but I've learned an extraordinary amount. And in one case, my research assistant, Hannah Gavin, actually was instrumental over the course of 12 months in taking the support I got from the Center for Effective Lawmaking and turning it into a journal article, a peer-reviewed article at the Wilson Quarterly, a bunch of op-eds on the Hill, etc. So CEL is just a wonderful set of resources, and they're backed up by the people on this call, like Aaron Torr and Gerald Rockwell and Millie Hicks, who really help us when we try to go live on something like this. Finally, I just wanted to abuse the goodwill of the chair by thanking one of our guests and listeners. I've seen on here that we've had the good fortune to be joined by Mary Buford and Fred Hitz, who are great friends of the school, great supporters of all we do. And I was just delighted to see them taking the time to join in the Batten Hour. And finally, thank you, Professor Volden, for letting a clumsy practitioner get involved in some really fascinating scholarship that has informed and help grow my own thinking through the Center for Effective Lawmaking at the Batten School. So thank you very much, Professor Volden, for including me today.
I'm seeing one last comment in the chat from Dean Solomon, who asks, can we measure effectiveness by the hiring of Batten graduates? And I think we might be able to do that soon. There's so many Batten folks up on Capitol Hill at this point. Just really exciting. Great to have those connections. They're helping our work at the center immensely by having those connections.
And Dean Solomon, I would say yes, because when people look for jobs on the Hill, another person on the call has been really helpful, Steve Hiss, thank you, in Career Services. But they go see Steve Hiss, they go see former Congressman Brad Carson, they go see Warburg or Volden, and they say, do I want to work in this office? Is this a great office? Is this a show horse? Are they tough on staff? And our Batten graduates have gotten some really extraordinary postings. Just this week, our Molly Cole left Congressman Conley. She's working for Senator Chris Van Hollen on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a wonderful set of offices to work in. But yes, Ian, members have avoided a few offices that don't have the greatest reputations, and they've gone towards those who tend to get much more involved in legislation, which is what we're training them to do here at Batten. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a job help tip, Ian. I really think it is.
And the other thing that I'd point to, now that we have up on our website the 21 different issue areas, if any students are looking to intern on the Hill and they're interested in some particular policy issue, click on the thing that sorts by health policy or whatever policy area you're interested in. Look at the top performers, go join their offices instead of feeling that oh, I thought this would be different and I have a mismatch there. Find effective lawmakers to spend your time with if you're interested in policy making, which Batten students are, and find those interested in their particular policy areas as well. So lots of opportunities there. Go to thelawmakers.org. And thanks so much for joining us again today.
Thank you, Professor Volden. Thank you for being with us, everybody. See some of you in class in just a little while for the Warburg Volden show continued.
Everyone have a great day. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Dean Rockwell.